Thanks for having me here. It's great to be back in Stowmarket in this wonderful building, the John Peel Centre. Yeah, do look at the Greenhouse literature later if you get a chance. It's all display copies only, but pretty much everything we do is available for free download on our website, which is easy to find. And I want to carry on in the vein of appreciation for a minute. I'm really appreciative of Mid Suffolk Greens for laying this event on, and for everyone who's taken the trouble to be here tonight, everyone who cares enough to come out on this night on this topic. I'm honoured to be here. And I'm here, of course, to talk with you about the climate and extinction crises. So let's start out with a few words about the IPCC process, which I think maybe we need to have that off. Is that okay?
It's all right. I'll just get that near your face.
All right.
Just move you over.
Yeah. Ah, very good. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so the IPCC has just met again. The UN have just met again in Katowice recently, as you've probably heard. It's the follow-up to the Paris Agreement meeting of a few years ago. And most of the world is investing a lot of hope in this international framework for climate change negotiations that reaches apogee in Paris. I want to spend just a couple of minutes to start us off talking about the Paris Agreement, because unfortunately we can't really vest the hope in it that the world has vested in it. So the Paris Agreement was an extraordinary achievement, a remarkable diplomatic achievement. Every country in the world agreed to tackle climate change, and they came up with some proposals to do so. But here's why the Paris Agreement, which is the most we can really expect from the so-called international community, here's why the Paris Agreement is not, I'm afraid, going to save us. Firstly, the Paris targets are inadequate. Even if they were achieved, they would almost certainly not limit global overheat to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels. Secondly, the Paris Agreement is essentially a voluntary agreement, and the countries that have signed up to it have all pledged to do such and such emission reductions in order to reach those Paris targets. But when you add up all the commitments from the different countries, they don't reach anywhere near the amount needed to reach the targets. So the targets are inadequate, and what the countries are committing to wouldn't reach the targets anyway. Thirdly, those targets are just words, they're just aspirations. They don't have any legal binding force, and moreover, there's a terrible problem in that most countries, arguably pretty much all countries, have plans which point in the opposite direction from those targets. So pretty much every country in the world is still pursuing their old-fashioned agenda of economic growth. They all want to build more railways, more roads, more airports. They all want to export and import more. They want to produce more. If you add up all the kinds of things that countries are planning to do, it would point in the exact opposite direction to the direction of those Paris commitments. And let me put this little thought experiment to you. On the one hand, you've got the climate change minister of a country saying, well, here's what we promised to do under the Paris Agreement. And on the other hand, you've got the business minister or the Chancellor of the Exchequer saying, yes, and here's what we need to do to grow the economy. Which of those two people in the government do you think is likely to win that argument? Which will get their way? It's not very hard to guess, really, is it, unfortunately? So the targets are inadequate. The commitments that the countries have don't reach the targets anyway, and other plans that the countries of the world have point in the opposite direction from those targets. The next problem with the Paris Agreement is that, additional to all that, actually Paris isn't all about reducing emissions, it's also about so-called negative emissions technologies for stripping carbon that's already in the atmosphere out of the atmosphere. There's a couple of problems with these technologies. The first problem is that they don't really exist. They're just sort of figments of the imagination, most of them, of scientists and engineers. The second problem is that the one or two that do exist are arguably absolutely reckless, deadly dangerous to deploy at a large scale. So the main one, which people are really sort of putting a lot of hope in that already does exist, is something called BECCS, which is basically growing lots of monocultural crops, burning them, sequestering the carbon, keeping the carbon underground for hundreds of years. It's not clear that it's possible to do it at all, but if it was possible to do it, it would require a vast area of land which should be being used to grow food, or at least to have diverse forests in it which are going to have proper ecosystems in them, not monocultures which are going to be just turned into burned material and carbon. So Paris is betting on the availability of these negative emissions technologies. They don't exist, and the ones that do exist shouldn't be employed. Next strike against Paris is that Paris doesn't take proper account, the UN process doesn't take proper account, the 1.5 degree report, which is the best report the IPCC have ever done, doesn't take proper account of feedbacks in the system, of, for example, the fact that we are losing more and more ice in the Arctic, as you no doubt know, and that means that more and more heat is being absorbed, less light and heat being reflected back into space. This is a vicious feedback. There's another vicious feedback to do with methane. Methane is being released from the permafrost. Methane is a greenhouse gas which is somewhere between 25 and 86 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. The more of it that gets released, the more you get a vicious feedback of more of the permafrost melting and more methane being released. So the charge sheet is pretty grave. And there's one more problem I want to add to all of those I've already enumerated, and that is that it's a few years since Paris. So we've had Katowice. Did things advance in Katowice? Well, not really. And it's not too surprising that they didn't, because since Paris, the climate's spiraled somewhat out of control. The science is worse than it was in 2015, and incredibly, the politics is worse as well. We now have Trump in America, we now have Bolsonaro in Brazil. You really couldn't invent a couple of politicians more calculated to destroy our chances of success in terms of reducing carbon emissions than those two jokers and fools. So what's the conclusion that one should draw from this? Well, I'm afraid the conclusion is fairly stark and fairly clear. We're not going to do it. We're not going to make it. We're not going to reach the Paris targets. We're going to have 3, 4, 5 degrees of global overheat, and this civilization, this industrial growth society cannot cope with that. This society is finished. It has a sell-by date. We don't know exactly what that date is. It's not going to carry on. Yes. I want to write something on the board. So, in this terrible circumstance we find ourselves in, there are, it seems to me, 3 possibilities. The first possibility they're called transformation. And transformation is that we look at this terrible situation, we accept that industrial growth society is at an end, and we decide rapidly to change everything. That's really what we need to do. Second possibility is collapse and recovery. Second possibility is that society as we know it collapses, it falls apart, and something comes out of the ashes, something new re-emerges. The third possibility is simply collapse. Society as we know it collapses, and that's it. Why might that one happen? Why might there be no recovery? There might be no recovery if the feedbacks that I was mentioning a minute ago go out of control. If we get into a situation where the temperature just keeps going up and up and up, and our society spirals down and down and down.
And that is entirely possible. Collapse, complete collapse, is entirely possible. We must aim for transformation, but we must accept that it is highly unlikely to be achieved. The system that we have, the global system that we have, is pointing absolutely in the opposite direction to it. It requires to be completely turned around. We must aim for transformation. We must have as a kind of insurance policy the idea that we might be able to recover after a collapse. And we must obviously try to head off complete terminal collapse. So what is to be done? I'll give you another list. First thing we need to do is wake up. We need to wake up to this reality. We need to wake up to the fact, and I put it to you that it is simply a fact, that this industrial goods society is doomed. It cannot possibly find a way through the situation that I just described. We need to wake up to this, realise this is not a drill, this is not an intellectual exercise, this is not a game, this is our future or potentially our lack of future. This is the world that our children are going to inherit. And then we must try to wake everyone else up as well. What does this mean in terms of activism? What should we do? Well, in politics, we've got to get decisively beyond politics as usual. Basically, what we need is the Green Party to be forming the government. Well, no, actually. Basically, what we needed is the Green Party to be forming the government a generation ago. But obviously, I don't have a time machine, and nor do you. So let's seize the moment that we do have. Now, this sounds completely incredible and impossible. Well, we are in a situation now where we have to do things which seem incredible and impossible. And we are in a time of very febrile politics, and a time when a lot of people are starting to wake up. I want to say to you, as you go into these elections this year, have in the back of your mind, and sometimes in the front of your mind, and sometimes in the words that you say to people, just how grim things really are, and how much worse they could get. And then aim very, very high, because there's no point in aiming any lower. We need to achieve a very rapid turnaround. We need to have Greens shooting forward. We need a green surge like the last time, but 10 times bigger and lasting 10 times longer. And it might just happen. You don't know that it won't happen. You can't know that it won't happen. If enough people wake up, it will happen. So we need to be ready for that surge. We need to be ready for the possibility that we might start to become a much larger and more influential party extremely quickly. As is happening right now in some parts of Europe. Have you noticed, for example, that the Green Party has moved into second place in the opinion polls in Germany? And some people think that in the next few months it will overtake the CDU, Merkel's party, she's stepping down from, and become the biggest party in Germany. Well, yeah, that's what we need to happen all over the world, including here. And there's no point in aiming for things that are much less than that. People sometimes say to me, well, what about the Labour Party, Rupert? Isn't that more realistic? The Labour Party is still committed to economic growth. The Labour Party is committed to HS2, to airport expansion. The Labour Party wants to produce more and more. The clue's in the name. It's about labour. It's about work. It's not about a completely new way of life. They're not about waking up to this enormous crisis. There are good people in the Labour Party, and I'll come to one or two of them in a moment. But if you want to pick a party that is the possible vehicle for the transformation that we now need, it's obvious that it has to be the Green Party. So, in terms of politics, let's make politics unusual. And let's take our commitment to that politics to a whole new level. If you're not in the Green Party, join. If you're an armchair member, become an active member. If you're an active member, become a much more active member, and aim high, aim to become a councillor. Think about becoming an MP as well. That seems completely incredible and impossible to us right now. In a year or 2 years, it may not. In a year or 2 years, it may not. Everything has to change. or everything is going to be taken out of our hands. But ordinary politics, even extraordinary politics, is not enough. We need to go beyond that. We need to go to non-violent direct action too. And here, the Green Party is in a great position, because the Green Party is the one party that has in its philosophical basis the suggestion, the imperative, that if things are sufficiently bad, then we don't rely on electoral politics alone, we use non-violent direct action. That's written into the Green Party constitution. The Green Party approves of doing this where it's necessary, and it plainly is now necessary. The stakes couldn't be higher than mass extinction and potential extinction of the human race. So we need direct action, we need to rebel, we need extinction rebellion. And the good thing is, of course, we've got it. And what happened when we took the bridges a few months ago was unprecedented. And what we need to do now is to take that unprecedented phenomenon and scale it up 5-10 times higher. When we talk about Extinction Rebellion being rebellion, this is meant quite literally. We do not accept the rules of a society which is committing us to the collapse of our society and possibly to extinction. How could we possibly accept it? So we're in rebellion, we declare rebellion. And I urge all of you in this room, again, to get involved with Extinction Rebellion. I know some of you already are, but everybody should be. If you're here this evening, you should get involved in Extinction Rebellion. If you can hear the things I'm saying about the dire future, the absolutely dire future that we face, what else can you do other than rebel against that? So I want to put a few dates in your diary. Starting with April the 15th, that's the most important date of all. April the 15th is the International Day of Rebellion and Extinction Rebellion. It's a weekday, so those of you who are have normal working lives, I'd urge you to book it off work. And what Extinction Rebellion are doing is they're asking everybody on that day who can to go to London. If you absolutely can't go to London that day, there'll be some kind of local events as well, I'm sure. But what we really need is bodies on the ground in London. It's going to be an unprecedented day of non-violent direct action and of rebellion, and it will hopefully lead to some real, unanticipatable change. Prior to then, another date which may be of interest to some of you is that alongside the Extinction Rebellion, there's the sort of what I regard as a sort of children's wing of Extinction Rebellion, which is the climate school strike movement, which some of you may have heard of. Children around the world. This is very, very moving, very, very inspiring. Children around the world are starting to say, why should we go to school and be taught all this stuff about a future that we're not going to see because the world's going to go to hell? And they're going on strike. And on February the 15th, it's going to be the first big day of the children's climate strike here in the UK. So if you, I don't know, are a teacher, or certainly if you're a parent, think about mentioning that to your children and seeing if they want to get involved. I think this is a movement. The fact that it's necessary to have this at all is such an indictment of the point to which our society has reached. But it's also such an inspiration. I think we must support it. And one more date, February the 11th, we in Norwich Extinction Rebellion are going to have a major action at County Hall in Norwich. And if any of you can come and give us some solidarity on that day, that would be great. James, give us a wave. James is from Norwich Extinction Rebellion, and he's very happy to talk to anybody afterwards who would like to come and get involved. But just to give you the basics, and this is the key facts that you need, February the 11th, again it's a weekday, it's a Monday, and we need you there by 9:15 outside County Hall, if you can make it. But do talk to James if you think you're going to be likely to be able to go. So unusual politics, and then beyond that into direct action and rebellion. A way I sometimes put this to people is, I say, your money or your life. What I mean by that is, it would be great if you could give us your life, if you can give us your time, if you can actually throw yourself into one or other of these causes and really devote yourself to them. Because unless enough of us do that, we're not going to have lives. And those of you who can't do that, maybe an alternative is you give us loads of money instead. And I do mean loads, right? Forget, the value of your house and so on and so forth. Forget leaving your house to your children and your grandchildren. It's no good to them if society's fallen apart. It's irrelevant. Think about what you're going to do with your will. If you've got £5,000 or £10,000 or £50,000, as I bet some of you in this room have, sitting in some kind of bank account or annuities and so on now, think about doing something radical with those now. That could make a huge, huge difference. These assets are going to be meaningless if this society collapses, and that is what is going to happen unless we transform it, unless we do something incredible. So think about that. Your money or your life. Or both. I'd say no to both. What does all this mean at the level of policy? So obviously we need to stop emitting all this carbon. And it just goes without saying. I'm not even going to bore you by going into that. You all know that. We need to radically reduce our carbon emissions. The Extinction Rebellion eye-watering target is it says 0 carbon Britain by 2025. How the hell are you going to do that? That's completely unrealistic. Yes, it's unrealistic within politics as usual. Politics as usual has to go. But what else? So here I want to say something which relates back to what I said before when I said we need to strive to transform this society, but we need to accept the probability, frankly, that there's going to be some kind of collapse. We need to put ourselves in a position, if that happens, to be able to recover from that. And what that means is we have to have a radical agenda of what in climate terms is called adaptation. We have to accept that dangerous climate change is coming, that it's almost certainly going to get a lot worse for a long time, and we have to try to adapt our society to that. And there are 2 key kinds of adaptation that involves. So the first kind is what we in Greenhouse, following the IPCC, call transformational or transformative adaptation. And what transformative adaptation means is it's not just a kind of ordinary adaptation of things like building higher sea walls, which are carbon intensive and are going to be overcome anyway as the waters keep on going up. It's adapting in ways that are actually flexible and help our society to transform. Adapting in ways that mitigate carbon at the same time and that push us and pull us in the right direction. So an example would be something like, rather than trying to build endlessly higher walls and dikes, would be recreating wetlands as a flood defence. And recreating various kinds of natural environment, mangroves, various kinds of natural environments, which can do the job of adapting and changing as, for example, the coastline changes as it's going to for us, in ways which are not carbon heavy, in ways that are not going to make the situation worse. So we need to start transformatively adapting now. I need to go further than that. Because of the likelihood of some kind of collapse, we need to do what is called deep adaptation. What is deep adaptation? Deep adaptation is the ultimate insurance policy. Deep adaptation says we need to prepare ourselves now for the possibility, the likelihood of some kind of collapse. We need to do things like, for example, start shutting down nuclear power stations, not opening new ones, and finding ways of making nuclear waste safe. Because remember, virtually all nuclear power stations are on the coast, right? And nuclear power stations need a lot of electricity and energy and supervision to stop from melting down and to stop from and their cooling rods, the cooling rods in the cooling pools. If those are not attended and kept cool, they burn dry and then they burn, and they will burn for decades. They'll burn toxic waste into the atmosphere for decades if they're unattended. It is utterly irresponsible and absurd to have an infrastructure that is, especially one that is growing, of nuclear power at a time when society may be in some kind of danger of collapse and of when our coastlines are in danger of being inundated. The deep adaptation agenda says think ahead, consider the possibility of collapse, and think about how we can start to act now to make that, if it happens, a lot less bad. Okay, so we're waking up, we're thinking about radical possibilities of serious activism, we're thinking about radical policy changes. What about on the more personal level or family level or something like that? What follows from this? I'm going to say a couple of final things about that and then I'll stop. So the 6th point I want to make, the 6th of my list of the things that we should be doing is stop. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of us in this room are activists. It would be very easy for us to rush into these things. Or a lot of us in this room are policy wonks, to rush into thinking about or publishing stuff, whatever, about these things. But we also need to stop. If we're really going to wake up, we need to stop and take stock. We need to actually try to absorb this and accept, which is very difficult as we sit here in this very civilized space, in this highly organized society, accept that this is real, that this threat is real, that it is likely to be realized, that to stop it from being realized, we're going to have to do something absolutely extraordinarily brilliant and powerful. We need to stop, we need to pause, we need to give ourselves time for it to sink in, we need to process it. That may involve emotional processing as well. If some of you, like me, have literally nightmares about these things or are grieving about it and so on, then I've got some flyers, which is the one thing I brought, which you can take away on the table, from the Climate Psychology Alliance, who have therapists and so on, who are working with people on this kind of new form of mental struggle that many of us are now having. And finally, something really, really important that can help us to struggle less is we need to talk. We need to talk about all this. We can't perpetuate the silence around it any longer. That's why I give these talks and break that silence. And what I find, one of the reasons I hesitated to start giving these talks is because I thought I'm just going to depress everybody. They're going to hate me, and maybe I'll kind of make people apathetic and so on and so forth. But that's not what I found mainly happens. What I found is that a lot of people respond rather by saying, "Oh, thank God we can actually talk about the fears that we've been having anyway now." And this is in a way liberating, to be able to let go of all the kind of crap and nonsense of climate optimism, of the people who say it's all going to be fine, we're just going to have some technical whizzes that we haven't invented yet, and we can carry on with our lives exactly as they are right now. To let go of all that, and also to be liberated from the assumption that you have to live a normal, respectable life. Because actually, that's going to be impossible pretty soon, unless a lot of us stop living a normal, respectable life. And again, that's one of the key points of Extinction Rebellion, mainstreaming the breaking of the law. Because in a society that's committing itself to self-destruction, how can it be right to always obey the law? So we need to talk. If we talk about all of this, if we share our fears and share our new hopes, our more realistic hopes, then things can get better, then things can improve. So in one moment I'm going to stop and we're going to talk. We're going to have a question and answer. Before I do that, I want to finish by saying this. I want to end this talk as I began with gratitude. Gratitude to everyone willing to face up to climate reality and the reality of the massive loss of biodiversity that humanity has caused. And everyone willing to struggle against the extreme odds alongside comrades in the Green Party and Extinction Rebellion for a future. So I want to say to you, be angry. You should be angry. But don't just come from anger. Be afraid. You should be afraid. If you're not sometimes terrified, then you're not paying attention. But don't just act from fear. Let your heart break from the grief of all this. But don't get stuck in the grief and don't give up. Because if we give up, then that's the one situation, the one scenario in which we know for sure that we're finished and that we're going to have a collapsed society on our hands. Be grateful. I think we need to concentrate people's minds on the fact that the stuff I'm talking about here is a lot of it's probably going to happen in the lifetime of many of the people in this room, perhaps most of the people in this room. And by definition, it's going to happen in the lifetime of the children of the people in this room. And to be very, very blunt about it, unless we succeed in doing these kind of things, many of those children are not going to have a life at all. Right? We are talking potential collapse in 30 years, 20 years, 10 years. We don't know when it will be, and we don't know how quick it will be. But we're not talking now about some remote event. We are talking about the IPCC, whose reports are extremely conservative, right? Extremely on the optimistic side as far as climate science goes, say that unless we transform our way of operating and reduce our carbon emissions by half by 2030, then this civilization is essentially stuffed. We show at present no sign of doing that. We're partly here to turn that supertanker around and do it, but you can't. It would be a very unwise person who would bet on that happening, and you can't bet on it. That's why we need to start engaging now in transformative adaptation and deep adaptation. The probabilities are stacked against us. So we're talking about a situation in which our children, who we love, we say we love above all else, are facing a terrible future or no future at all. Now, people don't want to hear that, but if you find ways of starting to enable them to hear it, then that potentially changes everything. And how do you do that? Well, talk to them. Try talking to them honestly. Try showing them one of my videos, whatever it might be. That's my biggest hope. That we can get through to people by getting them to understand that our children are not going to have a future unless this changes, unless everything changes. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Edward. We're sitting here, there are people sitting in Davos right now. Do you take any comfort at all from the fact that the business leaders of the world recognise climate change as their biggest business risk?
Well, yeah, I take a little tiny bit of comfort from it. There has been a fair bit of waking up over the past few years. And a lot of the super rich and the very powerful are not, complete fools like Trump and the people around him. They understand that this kind of trouble is brewing. And that's why a few of them are trying to build, refuges in New Zealand and nonsense like that. Which again, I think doesn't cut much ice, doesn't do much good once you really start to think long term, once you really start to think about your children and your children's children and your children's children's children. Because if runaway climate change kicks in, there's going to be no refuge for anybody. That's the way that you could get to my third scenario of total collapse. What kind of solutions will the people in Davos come up with? Well, some of them might be good, but the basic worry is that the solutions are unlikely to involve them losing their money and power. And as we've already kind of touched on, it's almost certain that they're going to have to lose a lot of their money and power if we're going to get to where we need to get to. So we need to try to influence those people among those Davos people who are genuinely open to doing something extraordinary and different, to really kind of, for example, giving their money away to radical causes, sure. But that's not where my main hope lies at all. My main hope lies in people power. My main hope lies in what we can do through the political system and beyond the political system, ultimately in rebellion. A few 100,000 millionaires at the end of the day don't have as much power as tens of millions of people on the march and standing in front of bulldozers and shutting down stock exchanges and shutting down 10 Downing Street and all the kinds of things that could happen if Extinction Rebellion really takes off.
Yes. Do you think there's something in human psyche that just isn't very good at long-term thinking? As you said earlier, we shouldn't do so much stuff decades ago. And I just wonder, I'm not being naysayer or doing mention at all, because I think there is some kind of weird sense of optimism here. But I just wonder, and you know, I've often wondered what separates people from me who think and have thought about things for a long time, but vis-a-vis those that don't. And I know that, you know, child rearing, which I have done, is tiring, and people have jobs, I have a job, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't seem to be quite that simple as those distractions, if you like.
Yeah.
That, you know, people not thinking and not being able to join the dots and think further ahead in the next year. I just wonder if you think.
Yeah, so look, I'm glad you said that there's hopefully a new hope in what I'm saying and what we're experiencing here this evening, because I think that's real. And I think what's even more important is that what I'm calling for here is courage. The courage to face up to reality and the courage to do enough about it. Now what you're asking is, well, why aren't more people already at that point? And why in particular do we seem to be so bad at long-term thinking? It's a really interesting question which I've thought about quite a lot. It's quite a big and complex question. I'll just say a few quick things about it. One thing is that there are various ways in which this society in particular discourages long-term thinking. So the way that our media operates, for example, has these incredibly short time horizons. The way that businesses operate, the importance of quarterly reports, again, relatively short time horizons. Governments are in power for 4 or 5 years. I mean, that's really an incredibly short period of time still, from an evolutionary point of view or even an ecological point of view. It wasn't always this way. Human beings in various times and places have been better at thinking long term. Think about the old days where people used to plant orchards a lot more than they do now, although orchards seem to be on the way back, which is good. Or another example I like is think about people in medieval times building cathedrals. Some of Britain's cathedrals took 80 odd years to build at a time when average life expectancy was about 40. So quite a lot of people, they'd been born and the cathedral was sort of like the foundations were built. And they died and it was approaching completion but not yet complete. But they didn't think, well, that's pointless, you know, what's the point of my life if I didn't see the cathedral finished? No, they saw themselves on a much kind of longer time scale as something that went on from the past, from past generations into future generations. Or think about indigenous peoples, the Native Americans, for example, who famously used to ask themselves with every decision, how will this affect the 7th generation down the line? How will this affect people living 150 to 200 years from now? You know, when was the last time you heard one of our politicians saying, you know, what I'm really interested in is leaving a legacy for the next 200 years? That's what we need to do. That's the kind of mindset that we need to shift into. That's what deep adaptation is doing. It's saying we need to think about what things are going to be like when sea levels, as they probably will be, are a metre higher or 2 metres higher. What kinds of massive changes do we need to make to coastal cities? What places do we need to give up, etc.? How are we going to defend nuclear waste dumps which are vulnerable to sea level rise, and so on and so forth. So I guess the main part of my answer is to say that it may well be that there's something in the human psyche which is not great at thinking long term, but I am confident that we can do a lot better than we are doing right now. And there are real historical precedents that show that human beings are capable of thinking a lot longer term, and I hope that we'll return to that.
I want to thank you very much for coming to talk today, first of all. But also I wanted to target one of the main angles of your speech. Well, not target them, but like bring it down. It's the angle of transformation of society, which obviously needs to happen. But from the talk, obviously, I'm not very. This is the first time I've heard of Extinction Rebellion. However, it does sound a bit like to me that it calls for the shutdown of several aspects of the capitalist society. Obviously, it's unsustainable. But from another perspective of the masses, which is also another concern, that intrinsically we are capitalists in our the ways that we live, and we want to accumulate things, and this means better standard of living for us. And yes, through children, perhaps we can change that way of thinking, although that is deep adaptation to that extent. Has Extinction Rebellion, have you yourself considered the ingratiating concurrently with this act of rebellion, ingratiating like environmental emphasis within sort of current capitalist like things that are ongoing. For example, like my example was biomimicry, so technology which uses biological-based information and sciences to create things such as bullet train and like lotus plant paint, which is a type of but in that aspect, these things which allow biologists and environmentalists to be in the boardroom of massive companies, this can bring a different voice to a one voice.
Yeah, sure.
So, is that also an aspect of this that's just not advertised as much, or is it perhaps something that can be explored and deepened so that there's an ingratiation into the existing system as opposed to looking like a complete opposition to what is a huge, huge society which has been built on for ages and is, this is why it's so worrying because it's been going on for so long, we don't really know how to.
Yeah, look, your question is well taken. My answer is, firstly, a lot of that's happening already. Now, what's not happening already is we're not getting green governments and we're not getting Extinction Rebellion demands met. So it's partly a question of where we need to put our energy and what are the biggest things that need to change. Second thing I would say is I'm sceptical of your suggestion that you said something like we're kind of intrinsically capitalist, we want to accumulate, get a better standard of living. Actually, I think that's all just ideology. And again, if you look deeper into history, or if you look deeper across cultures, you find plenty of examples of people who are not like that, peoples who are not like that. You find long periods of time in human history where there was no accumulation at all. You find indigenous peoples and some peasant peoples who are still perfectly happy living in traditional, relatively harmonious ways with the land. A lot of what we are told is human nature is actually capitalist ideology masquerading as human nature. We're told that human beings are individualistic and selfish, but actually if you look across human history, there's hardly been any time at all, except for recently in the West and then globalized across the world, where human beings have thought that they were like that or have generally acted in that way. So all of that, again, gives me hope that it is possible for us, it is conceivable that we could make these extraordinary shifts. And that's what we need to do. We need to make these extraordinary shifts. In terms of Extinction Rebellion's target, for example, of saying that we need to be zero carbon in this country by 2025, you can't achieve that by doing things like just having bullet trains and electric cars and so on and so forth. You need to mainly achieve that by burning a lot less, travelling a lot less. We're going to not just need to, maybe we're going to have electric cars, but as well as that, we're going to have to just take a lot of cars off the road. Take a lot of lorries off the road. And just shut down some power stations. And people say, well, that's totally unrealistic. Yeah, it's totally unrealistic within politics as usual, within politics as we know it. Everything has to change. If it doesn't, it's not going to be enough. It could be, it might be a bit less bad, but it's not going to be enough. There'll still be a collapse. There'll still be a collapse unless we change in a truly, radically transformational way. And of course, having some biomimicry rather than no biomimicry is good. But my real point is, it's not going to be enough. In order to do enough, we need to do the kind of things I've been talking about.
Sorry, I'm being greedy, I'm going to say something else. Not so much a question, just something that came to my head now. I don't know if anybody saw a fabulous documentary, I think it was last year, about Detroit, and the motor city and its decay. But some of the positives that come out of that is this much greater localism and local food growing, much more cohesive, localised communities.
Yes.
So it's the big factories of wind. And there's problems, of course there is, but out of that has come this fantastic, localised, not just food culture, but everything.
That's right.
Because people aren't keep travelling everywhere, constantly somewhere else all the time. They are having to be together, more together.
Yes.
And then it's better.
Detroit is
what we could have here.
That's right, yeah. Detroit is being re-greened. It's an extraordinary, true story. And as you imply,
it looks like it's having really good effects on people's quality of life. Not on their material standard of living, but on their quality of life. We have to get over this pathetic infantile obsession with standard of living, with having more and more material stuff, more and more plastic crap or whatever to throw away, right? That is going to stop soon anyway. The only question is, do we choose to stop it, or does an enraged nature force us to stop it, right? And that's not really what we need. That's not really what makes people happy. What makes people happy? What makes people happy is security. What makes people happy is love. What makes people happy is community. What makes people happy is having families and not being afraid that their families are about to be drowned by a tsunami induced by an undersea landslide caused by a massive release of methane. What makes people happy is not stuff mostly, actually, that we provide in this industrial growth society. It's the kind of thing that we could have in a transformed society, or in a society possibly that recovers from a collapse event. So again, there is actually much to look forward to. We just have to be willing to really think outside the box of what this society tells us is possible and tells us we need, and which is mostly, of course, what advertisers tell us what we need. And of course, what advertisers want, above all, is to keep you eternally dissatisfied, so you always buy more stuff. You're eternally thinking, I'm not good enough, so you always need to buy one more thing, right? Actually, there's a way of becoming satisfied and happier, which involves desiring less and not giving in to that kind of continual marketed discourse of you need more forever. More forever is destroying us, and it's not even making us happy. That's again the good news.
So it's a couple of minutes to 9. Do we have any time constraints for this meeting, or can we carry on until we're ready?
I think we're good for a little while longer. And Paris is going to sing a few songs before we go home as well.
Excellent.
Okay, I'll just take a couple of questions from this side because you haven't had much of a chance. Yeah.
Have you got any suggestions for how to tackle the very difficult issue of basically people in the developed world who consume a lot having children? Because there's rumblings about do you have things like Population Matters, which has come to the obvious criticism that it looks at global population, and there's things like educating women, providing better access to family planning, which actually has a whole load of benefits. But there is a certain element that our lifestyle, it's not sustainable for people to have as children, basically, who are then going to have similar lifestyles. And something that is very effective is people not having children.
Yeah.
And that's a very, very difficult political ask of people.
Yeah. It's another very hard sell. Yeah. How to go about it? I think one of the best ways to go about it is by one-on-one conversations, people sharing experiences. For example, people who haven't had children like myself and who are not terminally miserable as a result. And getting people to understand the paradoxical but true point that one of the best things we can do for our children is not have children, if you understand my meaning, right? That if we cease expanding our population and start gradually to reduce it, that's one of the best ways that we give ourselves a shot at having a future. Now, of course, as you implied, the children who cause the most trouble are rich children, and especially rich children in rich countries. So the population issue is sometimes presented as the problem of the Chinese billions and the African billions and so on. But actually the population problem is at its worst in countries like this, in countries like the United States, in countries like Australia, countries which are living way beyond their means. The most important countries to not keep expanding the population in are countries where people have a high footprint, which is quite the other way around from the way the population issue is sometimes presented. So population is, of course, not the only issue. The level of consumption, the level of wealth that is used, produced and discarded is in many ways even more important, but the two multiply together.
And if we're going to give ourselves a decent chance of safety, we do need to find ways of gradually building down our population to levels that are going to be able to be sustained in the long term. If we don't, then of course the population will crash in a horrible, more or less Malthusian way. That's what collapse is. And it's therefore only pragmatic for us to try to reduce our population somewhat. One final further point on this, which I think is really, really important, is people sometimes say, if you say the kind of thing that I just said, they sometimes say, well, aren't you sort of anti-human then, or something like that? And I say, firstly, no, noticing what I just said, if we actually want a future for humanity, this is what we need to do, so it's pro-human. But secondly, human beings are not all that matters. Right? This is one of the really important things about the Green Party agenda, one of the really important things about the Extinction Rebellion agenda. And the clues in the name of Extinction Rebellion, we're concerned about the possible extinction of humanity and the actual extinction of the vast numbers of plants and animals right now. Human beings are not all that matters, and we ought to clear some space for the non-human. One of the most terrifying and horrendous statistics of our time, which I'm sure many of you know, is that during my lifetime, we've extinguished over half of the world's wildlife. Over half of the world's wildlife gone within one person, well within one person's lifetime. I mean, it's just horrific. And why has that happened? Well, it's happened because of the wealth and stupidity of rich people and industrialists, and it's happened because of the sheer numbers of human beings. It's happened for both reasons combined. So we ought to clear some more space for other beings to flourish, or to share the world a bit more.
A few more questions. Just, yes.
You spoke at the beginning about nightmares and...
Sorry, speak up.
Sorry, you spoke at the beginning about nightmares, and if we didn't have them, we weren't facing the reality. And
Yeah.
I think, to be honest, it's one of the things that's preventing a lot of people actually facing up to what's going on. And I was talking to a woman today who's exceptionally sensible, and she said, you know, I'm terrified of the violence that will come out of a collapse before you even get to the stage of recovery. And how on earth would we deal with something like that? And she said, if that was going to happen, I'd rather not be alive. But how do you convince people that they've got to work to stop that? Because that's all they can focus on, I think, for a lot of the time. You know, I know all of us here have probably thought about it, and we're working our way through that in our own way.
Yeah.
But how, when you're trying to convince other people to take part in the conversation and engage with what they need to do for the future, how can you get them past that hurdle?
Yeah. So thank you for that really heartfelt question, which is a hugely important question. I'm sure is resonating with a lot of people. So this is partly the relevance, obviously, of my point 1, but also my point 6 and 7. That we need to slow down. We should take some time to process this. That may mean something like therapy. It may mean what Joanna Macy calls despair work, working on and through your despair. We need to talk about this with each other and not just have it go around in our own individual heads. And that's one of the things that I hope comes out of these talks that I give, that people then have a space or have people with whom they can talk more about these things. And when you've done a certain amount of that kind of processing and so on, then it seems to me that you do get to a place of being able to, and indeed really wanting to act, and what that form that action takes. You know, that's going to be to a large extent up to individuals. Some people may think that the best thing for them to do is to get involved in the transition movement, for example, locally, the transition towns movement, and to learn to grow their own food more and so on and so forth. I teach at a university. Sometimes people ask me for careers advice. Sometimes I say things like, well, learn to grow your own food. You know, that's a top piece of careers advice, whatever else you do. You may not have a conventional career, but we need people to be not just doing that. We need people also to be getting involved in the Green Party. We need people also to be getting involved in Extinction Rebellion. We can't solve this at an individual local level alone. It needs to be done also at higher levels. It needs to be done at the levels of nations, and to some extent at the level of global consciousness. We need to change our consciousness. That's really what waking up means. So that the rising up that occurs in our minds and in our souls then occurs in reality as well.
And it may well be that for a while, like your friend perhaps, one is just really grieving or suffering nightmares, or depressed or despondent and so on. But obviously it is pointless to stay in that condition forever. We need to cherish the time that we have, and we need to use the time and the power and the resources that we have to prepare for what's coming, to prepare for it in terms of adaptation, and to try to stop the worst parts of it, to try to give ourselves a proper shot at transformation. So it's really our responsibility, it seems to me, to look these things in the face and to deal with the emotions that come up, and then to find a way through that. But I'm not pretending that it's an easy or quick process.
Okay, just a few more. Firstly, from the gentleman here, and then the lady at the back, and then John.
And do take one of those leaflets,
Yeah,
maybe to your friend. Yeah, sorry.
So first.
Yeah, sorry, this is a kind of a question, because I'm particularly interested in the rebellion part of this.
Yeah.
Because I'm not a member of the Green Party. And I've become fed up with marches and getting nowhere, really. But I just think it seems to be very important, and the lady over there referred to this with the first question, that in doing the things that we're going to be doing, obviously it's the global issues, but I just think it is just crucial that all the time the link is being made with those people who currently aren't bothered about it because they haven't got enough to eat, they're trying to pay the rent, etc. They are in poverty, and I just think it's crucial that we make them that the reason why that is happening is that particularly a Conservative government, but governments that are only interested in protecting the profit motive, in keeping the wealthy and conning the rest of the population. And that has got to be part of the link. Otherwise, I don't think people are going to take notice of the crucial picture of the future of the planet. We've got to make that link so that they see it as equally important.
I think I mainly agree. I think some of what you're talking about there is the kind of stuff that the Green Party talks about, various kinds of policy changes that we need to make. And certainly it's also really important that, as we were saying before, that we acknowledge the people who are already kind of suffering a sort of small-scale collapse in their lives, or looking abroad to worse scenarios, places like Syria and Yemen and so on and so forth. I would, however, add that you ain't seen nothing yet. Right? If you think that it's bad having to live off food banks and not having a solid job and so on and so forth, well, wait till there are 10 million climate refugees trying to get into this country, or wait till we don't have food, any of us, to feed ourselves. Remember that this country cannot feed itself. That's one of the fundamental absurdities about Britain at the present time, that we're in an incredibly vulnerable position because we cannot feed ourselves. We're way short of being able to feed ourselves. Well, we probably could if we were to have a mostly vegan diet and eliminate almost all food waste and stop the grouse moors and transform the food system and a load of other things, and not carry on increasing our population. It's going to be a big ask.